Tonight's program is sponsored by Allison Green. And I'll just mention that since Allison works for Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California, I really feel so fortunate that Jay has put their archives, more than a century of past issues, online earlier this year. It's really an amazing opportunity to get these pictures of the past. And I encourage all of you to give it a shot. I'll send you a link in an email that we send out tomorrow. I also want to dedicate this program to the memory of Bert Meyer, who died earlier this year. Bert was a native San Franciscan who really delighted in the city's history, and we had a great time doing research together. Before I begin, I want to offer some quick technical notes. Automated closed captioning can be accessed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen and selecting Show Subtitles. You can turn off those subtitles by clicking the CC button and choosing Hide Subtitles. Everybody will be muted during the program except me, but there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. And you can feel free to put your questions in the chat. I will not be able to see them until the end. I also want to offer something of a disclaimer. I am not an academic historian, and I know that there are quite a few people here with direct experience of the Fillmore when it still had a Jewish character, and I don't. So I'm just doing what I can as a history buff. I'm sharing what I've learned, but don't take it as the last word. We're lucky to have people with us tonight with firsthand memories. And in fact, given the number of people here with a deep connection to the Fillmore, I think it actually would be fun for another occasion if we had an opportunity to take advantage of the technology and have a sort of an informal schmoozing event to share experiences and memories. One thing I want to be emphatic about when I tell this story is that this is just one piece of the quite extraordinary history of the Fillmore. I'm a little bothered when I hear comments like the Fillmore used to be Jewish, because the truth is that the Fillmore was always a multi-ethnic district, one of San Francisco's most diverse districts throughout its history. Jews, Japanese Americans, and African Americans were especially large communities, but the area also hosted Mexicans, Filipinos, and other ethnicities. I'll be focusing narrowly on the Jewish experience, but I don't want that to be understood to be ignoring their experiences, which I could actually talk about for a very long time. And unlike the Jewish experience, is often marked by injustice and trauma. So certainly one of the questions posed by Jews who do come to San Francisco, especially from New York or Chicago, is where is the Jewish neighborhood? And the answer is that we don't have one, but we used to. Okay. So I want to start with a little bit of a history/geography lesson. So up until the 1850s, the western boundary of the city of San Francisco was Larkin Street. This is sort of a sideways map, but it's how most maps look today. And you can see that left, where there's sort of nothing to the left, that's Larkin. It actually might be seen better in this later map. I put a red line down Larkin, and you can see that the land to the left of the red line would have been unsurveyed up to around 1851. Then we had the Van Ness Ordinance, which was named after the then mayor, Van Ness, and that expanded the city and called for surveying all of the land immediately west of downtown, from Larkin Street to Divisadero Street on the west. And so that red box is the western addition that was established in the 1850s. Come the earthquake and fire of 1906, and the fire department made a stand to keep the fire line at Van Ness. So this is the fire that was viewed from Alamo Square, and it will not reach Alamo Square because the fire line, because of where the fire line was. Nearly everything east of Van Ness was destroyed, but since Van Ness was only 2 blocks west of Larkin, this means that only 2 rows of blocks of the western addition were burned, and the rest is battered, but mostly intact. So what had happened prior to the fire in the western addition was really that people had moved from the much more congested downtown and built very nice homes. This is the late 19th century, so you have these wooden Victorian homes. And there were streetcar lines installed, so it was very easy for them to get to the western addition from to downtown and back. So now, though, with everything destroyed, the Fillmore district is transformed into the city's business and entertainment and residential center, while the downtown neighborhoods are being rapidly rebuilt. Here's 1907, what it looked like. And people of all social classes start to pour in. Whereas in the late 19th century, it was a wealthier area. You now have many of those stately single family Victorians that had been built then becoming divided into rooms and flats. The neighborhood becomes more densely populated and much more ethnically and economically diverse. In 1907, just after the earthquake, to celebrate the neighborhood's new status as the city's sort of business capital, local merchants helped construct curving metal arches adorned with lights over 14 intersections that were strewn along a 1-mile stretch of Fillmore Street. So let's talk about the Jews. Most people know at least vaguely about the pioneering Jews who initially came from Germany and Central Europe to San Francisco. In the mid-19th century, Jews made up 1/10 of San Francisco's population, the highest percentage in any city west of New York. By 1880, San Francisco had the second highest Jewish population in the country. And they were doing really well, uniquely well, socially, economically, and politically. A fair number of these established Jews had already moved to the Western Addition by the turn of the century. And you can still see some of the evidence today. Ohabai Shalom on Bush Street, which is still there. It's now a Japanese senior center. Sherith Israel and the beginnings of Mount Zion Hospital were both established in the northern part of the district before the earthquake. And then in the late 19th century, San Francisco starts to see the immigration of Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe. It's not by accident that the numbers did not approach the great numbers that were seen on cities in the East Coast, as the established community did not extend a welcome mat to these new immigrants. There was a lot of fear that this much less acculturated and educated group would endanger the standing of the Jews from German-speaking territories who had so successfully established themselves in San Francisco. Rabbi Jacob Vorsanger of Congregation Emmanuel actually sought to prevent their immigration, and different proposals were floated as to what to do with the incoming East European Jews, one of which was to acquire land in Baja California to resettle them. So they still came. And by I think by 1910, there were about 14,000 Jews who were living in San Francisco. And I'm sorry, but 1914, there were about 10,000 Eastern European Jews who would come to San Francisco, pardon me. And they lived overwhelmingly in the South of Market area, where there were kosher butchers and bakeries, multiple shuls. We had several thousand East European Yiddish-speaking Jews living in South of Market prior to 1906. The area was completely destroyed by the 1906 fire, and that community was suddenly homeless. Some returned south of Market when they could. Congregation Hever Tillam, which many of you know, rebuilt its shul there and stayed at Howard and Russ until 1930, when it moved to the Richmond. And some Jews, especially more observant Jews, went to the Portola district, which boasted a significant community as well. But most made their way to the Fillmore. And as Jewish immigration continued until the federal restrictions of the 1920s reduced it to a trickle, the Fillmore was the primary destination for Yiddish-speaking Jews coming to San Francisco, becoming the second largest immigrant Jewish neighborhood west of the Mississippi, after the significantly larger community of Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. Jews lived in many parts of the Fillmore, but the heart of the Jewish quarter was from Steiner on the west to Laguna to the east, and from Eddy to Grove. And the epicenter was McAllister Street. Standing at McAllister and Fillmore today, one cannot imagine the bustling marketplace this once was. From Fillmore to Goff, the entirety of McAllister Street was bulldozed in the 1960s and 1970s during the unfortunate redevelopment campaign, and not a single building remains from that era. Here's a reading from the WPA Federal Writers Project from the 1930s that captures the neighborhood nicely. Near the southern end of Fillmore's street, lengthy marketplace, where its noisy turbulence gives way again to prosaic respectability at the foot of another hill clustered with turrets, bay windows, and mansard roofs, lies the city's Jewish commercial center, the heart of the before the fire section, where, I don't know if that's bedizened or bedizened, old houses of the 1880s advertise housekeeping rooms on grimy signs. Yet paradoxically, here is a gourmet's paradise. Along adjacent blocks of Golden Gate Avenue and McAllister Street, the atmosphere is spicy with the odors of delicatessen shops, bakeries, and restaurants. In a dozen strange tongues, bargaining goes on along McAllister Street, San Francisco's secondhand row, for begrimed statuary, ancient stoves, Brussels carpets with faded floral patterns, chamber pots and perambulators, Dresden figurines and fishing tackle, gilt-framed oil landscapes, and canary bird cages. Gathered in this district are a large number of the city's 30,000 Jews, most of them immigrants from Eastern Europe, many being recent arrivals. The sole exception from the demolition of McAllister Street is this facade of a fire station building that was embedded into a housing development as a symbol of the past. And if you look at this old picture of that same firehouse, you'll see that next to it stood Shenson's Deli. And here's a close-up, which is a nice segue to what many people remember most from the neighborhood, the food. If you talk to an old timer, they'll talk about the pumpernickel or rye bread at the Ukraine bakery or the pickles at Drabkin's. This area had many, many purveyors of Jewish food, and I'll share a few. This is the counter at Shenson's. Diller and Woloski, who you see at the bottom, apparently had difficulty spelling Manischewitz. Here's the inside of Diller's Delicatessen. That should not be confused with Diller's Strictly Kosher Restaurant on Golden Gate between Webster and Fillmore. There were many markets and delis. This is at Fillmore and Turk. Petaluma Market was run by Joseph Sosnick, whose family would become the dominant distributor of kosher foods in Northern California. Here's the Eagle Market. There was Drabkin's for fish, and here were Mendelssohn's food operations. Here's an ad in Yiddish for Mendelssohn's, and if you don't think your Yiddish is good enough to understand, I've enlarged the top on the right, which reads, Lamed Mendelssohn, Wholesale und Retail Grocers. The Fillmore boasted a large number of Jewish restaurants. Schindler's on Golden Gate, which was replaced by Kretsch's. White's was around the corner on Webster. I'm wondering what Sukkot dishes came out of the kitchen at Mrs. Kellerman's restaurant on McAllister. For Hungarian food, there was the National Hungarian Kosher Restaurant on Fillmore and Eddy, as well as Juliska's Hungarian Restaurant on Golden Gate. There was the New Yorker on Fillmore and Fulton. There was the Famous, and there was the Grand Dairy Restaurant on Fillmore and McAllister. There were produce sellers. Here's Waxman's Bakery on McAllister and Webster. And here's their bread being made. Probably the most famous bakery was Langendorf's. Bernard Langendorf came from Vienna, and Langendorf's breads were delivered throughout the city. Here's the Europa Bakery. And here's the Ukraine, which was the last holdout, I believe, closing in 1968. Of course, it wasn't all food. There were cobblers, watch repairers, tobacconists. Since my heart is in books, here's Koblick's Bookstore, known for its comic book selection, and Waxman's Bookstore, which later became Lieber's Bookstore. And there was a staple of the neighborhood was antique furniture shops, as was mentioned in that WPA piece, some of which might be called junk shops, which is actually the business that remained the longest in the neighborhood. McAllister Street is where many newcomers to the city came to get cheap furnishings for decades. So let's move now to the religious life of the neighborhood and discuss the neighborhood synagogues. Look at the picture from the 1940s taken from Fillmore and Sutter by the African-American photographer David Johnson, and you'll see how Congregation Beth Israel loomed over this area. This was actually Beth Israel's third building. The congregation was founded in 1860 and leased several buildings downtown before constructing their own building downtown on Turk in 1879. In 1890, having outgrown it, they built a building on Geary and Buchanan. And having outgrown that one, they built a new one on Geary between Fillmore and Steiner. And unfortunately, their timing was a bit off. As you see in this photo, it was close to completion when the 1906 earthquake struck. Here's another angle. This area did not see the fire, but it was not immune from the quake, and masonry buildings were very vulnerable. Here's a wedding party outside the synagogue's entrance in around 1910. Beth Israel was one of the biggest synagogues in San Francisco. How Fred Rosenbaum voiced it is that it was in the neighborhood, but not of the neighborhood. And I think what he means is, although it started out as what we call Orthodox, it eventually leaned conservative. And the immigrant community was far more likely to be Orthodox or to discard religion entirely. Elliot Burstein was the congregation's longtime rabbi from 1927 to 1969. Here he is with the confirmation class in the 1920s. Joseph Rabinowitz was the congregation's cantor for many years. And here are Rabbi Burstein and cantor Roman Sikowski. Cantor Sikowski, who was born to a Hasidic family in Lodz, Poland, had actually been part of the internationally famous German singing group, the Comedian Harmonists. Along with the other Jewish members of the group, he left Germany during the Nazi era. He became a cantor in the US and served Beth Israel for 25 years. Beth Israel actually attempted to leave the neighborhood in 1949 when it purchased this building at 14th and Balboa in the Richmond district, which will be familiar to many of you as the later home of the Jewish Community Library from 1975 to 2003. They bought it with the intention of tearing it down and building a new shul. This is actually something that I did not know until I went through the Jay's archives. But they did not end up tearing it down, thank goodness. And it became the temple house, and the religious life of the congregation was divided between the two buildings in spite of their being miles apart. Finally, in 1969, Beth Israel merged with Temple Judea, a Reform congregation, to form Beth Israel Judea, building a new synagogue on the newly created Brotherhood Way, south of San Francisco State. As an aside, the Geary Synagogue had a fascinating afterlife, which included serving as a punk rock concert hall in the late 1970s, and then becoming an amazingly ornate art installation called the Duquette Pavilion, enacting the fantasy of the Hollywood designer Tony Duquette. Unfortunately, an electrical fire in early 1989 gutted the building, and it was torn down along with the neighboring Alfred Pike Memorial Temple, a Masonic hall, which had been badly damaged in the 1989 earthquake. Today, their sites are home to a post office. Note that an extremely common but incorrect belief is that Jim Jones's People's Temple took over the Beth Israel building. This is in many books and all over the internet. The building purchased by the People's Temple in the early 1970s was the Masonic hall next door that I just mentioned, as this picture shows. So that's Beth Israel on the left and the People's Temple in the Masonic temple to the right. Anshe Sfard, known as the Golden Gate Shul and officially called Anshe Sfard in Romanian, was established by Romanian immigrants in 1893 south of Market. You can see in this picture with the Yiddish sign that in spite of its name, this was not a Sephardic synagogue. Most likely it got its name from using Nusach Sfard, which is the prayer style preferred by Hasidim. After their synagogue on Howard Street between 5th and 6th burned in the 1906 fire, they moved to rented quarters on Steiner and Golden Gate. They then built a synagogue on Golden Gate near the corner of Buchanan, which you can see here And then they built a larger one down the block at 1140 Golden Gate that I do not have a picture of. The synagogue's rabbi during its heyday in the Fillmore was Rabbi Meir Hirsch, who received his rabbinical education in Lithuania. He was not only one of San Francisco's premier rabbinic authorities, but he made wine using kosher grapes grown by his father-in-law, Rabbi David Rudinsky, in Napa. Rabbi Hirsch died in 1946 at the age of 68. The congregation was then led by a succession of cantors. And in 1958, their building was taken through eminent domain to build a housing project. And they announced that they would be meeting in a storefront at 18th and Clement in the Richmond while building a new synagogue. And they opened their new building at the corner of 16th and Clement in 1959, which today is actually a Sephardic synagogue. Knesset Israel was a south of Market shul that was formed by the union of two synagogues. There was their synagogue on Russ Street, south of Market, when it was completed in September 1903. And after it was destroyed in the fire, a philanthropist named William Wolfe actually purchased Beth Israel's old building that I just showed you in order to have a synagogue that would offer free services and education. And he offered to give it to Knesset Israel with a stipulation that the synagogue would change its name to the William Wolfe Congregation. So for a number of years, Knesset Israel was the William Wolfe Congregation on Geary and Laguna. And then after he died, the congregation sought to release themselves from that building and from the name. And they built a new building on Webster between McAllister and Golden Gate in the heart of the Jewish section of the Fillmore. There were two kosher restaurants on the block. In 1920, they installed Wolf Gold as their rabbi. He was a major leader among Orthodox Zionists. And known as the Webster Street Shul, the synagogue became the largest Orthodox synagogue in the city. Here's a flyer from its golden days. Sadly, in 1929, their building was again destroyed by fire. The congregation met on Grove Street for a while, and during that time they rebuilt. And this is when they rededicated their new building in 1930. And you can see the interior of it. And another glimpse of the entrance. Sadly, the congregation would decline over the decades and suffer terrible blows. With redevelopment of the Fillmore district over the period of decades, the neighborhood went into rapid decline. Vandals destroyed much of the interior and the shul announced its closure, but they actually did reopen. And then a year again, it happened again. It was vandalized and terrible damage to the synagogue, and they finally gave up. You can see this article in the Jewish Bulletin. The synagogue was boarded up and then torn down, and the congregation moved to a succession of office buildings closer to downtown, and it really became mostly a place for visiting observant Jews. There were also shtibelech in the neighborhood, small shuls, notably congregation Beth Midrash at Turk and Buchanan, which was the shul of Rabbi Gershon Katzman, who was a great scholar who had come to San Francisco from White Russia in 1914 for a medical procedure and had been stranded there by the outbreak of World War I and ended up staying. He ended up leading Chevra Tillim and then starting his own shul. He died in 1952. They still had a twice daily minyan in 1954 when it seems to have ceased operations. Congregation or Torah was founded by Rabbi Achiezer Rubinsky, a Talmudist who had fled Russia in 1921 and served as Knesset Israel's rabbi for 11 years. It was on Golden Gate between Fillmore and Steiner. And you can see this notice from 1948. The shul ceased when he retired in 1952. So I want to talk about Jewish education, which played a very significant part in the community. With the exception of the Reform synagogues, synagogues did not offer their own religious schools. The Jewish Education Society was a communal organization that ran schools in the neighborhoods, south of Market, the Portola, the Mission, eventually the Richmond, and most of all the Fillmore. Here's a photo from the beginning of the 1920s of the Society's Central Hebrew School on Webster between Grove and Fulton. You can see it's hard to read, but on the first floor, there's a little sign that says Talmud Torah. Fortunately, quite a number of houses in this pocket actually survived redevelopment. And you can see this house today with the awning that says, interestingly, the spiritual eye. This was a time of dispute between the Orthodox community, led by Rabbi Wolf Gold of Knesset Israel, and the Federation-supported Jewish Educational Society, primarily because of the Orthodox community's disapproval of Moshe Menuhin, who headed the Jewish Education Society's schools. The Orthodox community began a separate school at the Jewish Center at 926 Grove. This was a building that the Orthodox community had acquired with the intention of creating their own community center. The building is actually still there. It's a beautiful old mansion. They then came to an agreement to reunite as long as the schools would be run not by the Central Hebrew School's current head, Moshe Menuhin, but by Lithuanian Rabbi David Stolper. To house the expanded school, as well as the Hebrew Free Loan, a new building was erected in 1926 at Grove and Buchanan. It was designed by Irving Morrow, who later was the chief architectural consultant for the Golden Gate Bridge and actually came up with the distinctive burnt red orange color called International Orange. Here's the interior of the auditorium. And here it is filled with kids and Rabbi Stolper. School was held every day, and on Saturday mornings, it functioned as a full-fledged synagogue called Kol Yaakov, with services led by the students. And when a Central Hebrew School student became a bar mitzvah, it generally was here and not in their home synagogue. For a sample of the school's events, here on the left is a Hanukkah celebration from 1926. I know it's hard to read, but I'll tell you that the featured events are a debate in Hebrew, followed by a 2-act play called Nachas von Kinder, performed in Yiddish. And the notice on the right describes a Purim celebration featuring a 3-act play performed by the students in Yiddish called The Tragedy of Intermarriage. The school closed in 1948 after many of the Jewish families started leaving the neighborhood. It was sold to the School for the Blind, and today it is a Korean community center. They were actually making an effort to replace this building with a more modern one, but now, fortunately, they seem to be renovating it. You can see it's been painted, not particularly attractively, but if you walk up Ivy in the back and peer through to the courtyard, you can see the original unpainted brick with the Stars of David in the auditorium windows. But I want to make it clear that not all Jews in the Fillmore were religious. The Fillmore was also a bastion of Jewish leftism and Yiddishism. The language of McAllister Street in the teens, 20s, and 30s was Yiddish, and San Francisco supported Yiddish culture in numerous ways. Once Yiddish movies came into being, you could watch them at the Clay on Fillmore, which is still there, albeit closed. But much more important was Yiddish theater. The Garrick at Fillmore and Ellis had live Yiddish theater, which, as you can see from this article, was quite popular. On February 16th, 1921, you could choose between watching Anna Pavlova dance at the Curran downtown or watching Yiddish theater performed at the Republic Theater at Steiner and Sutter. The Republic even featured Yiddish drama giant Boris Tomaszewski, the grandfather of Michael Tilson Thomas. And there was lots of live theater in Yiddish downtown, just a 10-minute streetcar ride away, including Maurice Schwartz's Yiddish Art Theater, featuring Schwartz and Celia Adler. This was the Columbia Theater, which was at O'Farrell near Market. There was also a very active local Yiddish theater called the Yelidra or Yidra, and here is lead actress Basia Bibel. And here's more of their troupe. Their performances took place primarily at the Golden Gate Commandery on Sutter and Steiner, which is today the Macedonian Baptist Church. To talk about Yiddish culture in the Fillmore, one has to discuss the gorgeous building at 1057 Steiner and Golden Gate, which is still standing and is today the Chateau Tivoli Bed and Breakfast. First, some backstory. Remember when I mentioned how Rabbi Vorsinger of Emmanuel was so unwelcoming to Eastern European immigrants? Well, in Emmanuel's defense, while they did their best to keep them out, once the East European Jews were here, the German Jewish establishment was quite focused on providing services to them. Part of this was altruism, and part of it was self-interest. They wanted these Jews to acculturate as quickly as possible, and they did not want Jews to form a Yiddish-speaking ghetto. And one thing that they did was to build the equivalent of the settlement houses that had been established in the Eastern and Midwestern urban centers. This building was constructed as a mansion in 1892 for an Oregon lumber baron, but from 1917 to 1923, it was the headquarters for the Emmanuel Sisterhood's residence for single Jewish women, where they provided acculturation and services and residence, in a full kitchen and lots of things for working Jewish women, and as well as to girls who had aged out of the Jewish orphanage on Divisadero. There wasn't enough space, so they actually ended up renting 2 other buildings that were close by. They then built a larger structure at Page and Laguna, designed by Julia Morgan, which opened in 1923. And I'm sure many of you recognize this building as being home today to the San Francisco Zen Center. And you can go there, and it's just really, really lovely. Meanwhile, that Yiddish cultural group came up with the idea of a Yiddish cultural center for the Fillmore. And that's what this building became in 1929. For 32 years, it provided secular Jewish activities, lectures, it was home to a theater troupe, and as well as concerts, and then a secular Jewish school conducted in Yiddish called the Yiddish Volksschule. Here's a flyer for the Yiddish Volksschule. And it says there, schickt eure Kinder in der Jiddische Volksschule, send your children to the Yiddish Volksschule. Here's a picture of some of the students with their teacher, Akiva Messerman. One of the main figures in the Volksschule was Bernard Sackheim, who had left Russia and become eventually one of America's great muralists, known best for his work in Coit Tower, which you can see him working on in this photo. He taught art to children and adults at the Volksschule, and in 1930, he organized an exhibition of Yiddish artists at 1057 Steiner that drew significant attention. The building also hosted many concerts and other cultural events. Here's a flyer for a concert. And then they also were home to many left-leaning organizations, especially for special events. Here's one for the IKUF, which was the Jiddische Kulturverband, which was a communist-leaning secular Yiddish organization. There's a Jewish Labor Committee event. The building was also used frequently by the labor Zionists associated with Poale Zion. Here's a talk from April 1951 by the editor of the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which was the newspaper of the Yiddish anarchist movement. The socialist-leaning Yiddish-focused workmen's circle was very active in San Francisco. They chiefly offered political and cultural lectures, and they were headquartered on Fulton, where they actually had a reading room. And then they moved to the Labor Lyceum that was on O'Farrell and Fillmore. However, largely in response to sectarian infighting on the left, their headquarters were then moved to 1057 Steiner. And here you can see an announcement of a meeting of their youth wing, the Young Circle League, for a discussion of fascism. Communist events were actually more likely to take place at the Labor Lyceum on O'Farrell and Fillmore. Here are meetings of the E-Corps, which was a group raising funds primarily for the Soviet Jewish agricultural settlements in the Crimea. And this was not only a communist organization. Here's another benefit. You can see at the bottom, tools and machinery will be sent to the agriculturists in the Soviet state with the proceeds. One of the most significant Yiddish and political events was the arrival in 1943 of Soviet Yiddish poet Itzik Pfeffer and the great Soviet Yiddish actor and theater director Shlomo Michoels to San Francisco to speak in Yiddish at the Civic Auditorium. Michoels was the chair of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee created in the Soviet Union to help support the Soviet war effort. And actually, you can see the Fillmore connection in a close-up at the bottom, which states that tickets are available from Waxman's Bookstore on McAllister and Gallant's Liquors on Fillmore. Neither Pfeffer nor Michoels would be alive a decade later, both murdered by Stalin. Next to the Yiddish Cultural Center this is on Steiner, is a purple house that also has a wonderful history. This is where the great violinist Yehudi Menuhin spent his early childhood. I've already mentioned his father, Moshe Menuhin, who was born in Russia and educated in Jerusalem and was brought in to be the director of the Central Hebrew School. Here is Yehudi with his teacher, Louis Persinger, who was the concert master of the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. This is in 1927. Yehudi gave his first solo performance with the San Francisco Symphony when he was 8 years old. And people talk about standing outside the home and just listening to him practice in rapture. It should not be forgotten that Yehudi's sister, Hepzibah, was also a child prodigy on the piano. And here's a notice of her performance at the Scottish Rite Auditorium, 8-year-old pianist. And there are a lot more things to talk about in the neighborhood, other institutions, other people, but this is a lot. And I want to make sure there's opportunity for discussion. So I guess I want to end with a note about the end of the Fillmore as a Jewish neighborhood. Frankly, it's a very, very complicated story. I will say that, as I sort of said in the beginning, that for Japanese Americans and Black Americans, the Fillmore represents an experience of great things, but also enormous tragedy. More than 90% of the city's Japanese Americans lived in Japantown, and after the towering injustice of being imprisoned during World War II, they came back to multiple challenges. And the Black population of the Fillmore, which increased dramatically during World War II, was hit terribly by the two phases of redevelopment. This is less true for Jews. Jews built a community and most left of their own accord. As the Fillmore was getting more run down, the Richmond and the Sunset were being built up, really built from sand dunes to become affordable and comfortable places to live. And with synagogues either moving there or being built there, and restaurants and other institutions to meet the needs of Jewish residents. Young Jewish men who qualified for the GI Bill after World War II also took advantage of the opportunity to buy their own homes. We can see the waning in the movement of those institutions to the Richmond and Sunset. Shenson's moved to the Richmond in the 1960s. This ad shows that Drabkins, or then Regina's, moved from McAllister to Irving and 24th in 1967 in the Sunset District. And here's Lieber's Bookstore, which moved from McAllister to the Richmond as well. And then there was also development in the peninsula in Marin County. There was really quite a dispersal of the Jewish residents of the Fillmore. Of course, there were people who did stay towards the end, and there were especially the older people who, especially people who at Knesset Israel, who walked to Shul, and really that was a great challenge because the neighborhood had become increasingly dangerous. But the truth is that this was the changes over the course of the 20th century. America changed and there were increasing economic opportunities for Jews, less discrimination. And once the redevelopment started happening in the 50s, the neighborhood really seemed increasingly doomed. Some of the food vendors persisted as people continued to make pilgrimages from the other neighborhoods for baked goods and kosher food, but it was all mostly gone by the early 1970s. What was frustrating for me, I should say, is how difficult it was to learn about this community for many years. It was really confined for years and years to Jerry Flamm's, to a chapter in Jerry Flamm's book about the Depression years. And then Fred Rosenbaum devoted part of a chapter to it in his book, The Cosmopolitans. But I've been fortunate to interview and talk with many people and get some sense of what the neighborhood was. And maybe one day somebody will write a book. But now you know much more of the story, I hope. And I would like to now stop sharing and open up for some discussion. All right.
Thank you so much, Howard. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Also a request for you to write that book. Several requests, in fact. Rochelle and Chaim ask, could you please share some info about Beth Israel's history during the Great Earthquake?
I don't know enough of it to be, I don't know if Judy Leff is on this call, but she would be the definitive historian of Beth Israel. But it survived relatively well. It had been, it did not suffer the fate of what you saw in Beth Israel. And it actually was put to use immediately after or very shortly after the earthquake. But somebody can probably, that's not a definitive answer. The answer is I don't have a good definitive answer.
I'd like to encourage folks to put their questions in the chat if they have them, or if anybody has like reflections that they'd like to share from their experience growing up in the Fillmore. There is a question about, Yetta Robinson asks if you have any information about Rabbi Bernard Robinson, who had a little shul on Buchanan Street and died in 1932.
I saw that. I was not able to find more information. I did find out about him, and I was not able to find anything about the shul. I have found this extremely difficult to research, frankly. And one of the difficulties is that hopefully the materials at the Magnus that were at the Western Jewish History Center will be more accessible. This was not good timing with COVID to try to find, to go through some of the archival materials they have there. But in terms of the documentation of the smaller, certainly the smaller shuls and shops as well, it's a challenge. And I didn't go as deep as was necessary to find some of that information. And definitely finding photographs is a huge challenge. And if anybody has photographs in their family of the neighborhood, I would love it if they would contact me, because it seems to be that there's a very small number of photographs of the neighborhood that are in circulation. And it would be lovely for everybody to have more to help inspire the imagination to recreate what was.
Thank you. Leah Greenblatt asks, my family owned Greenblatt's hardware in the Fillmore for many years. Have you heard of it? How can I research it? I was disappointed that the historic plaques didn't mark the hardware store, and I'd love to talk to you more about this.
Great. So what she's referring to about the historic plaques, part of the sort of refashioning of the Fillmore after the redevelopment, there was an attempt, since they had destroyed most of the Fillmore, and I didn't go into redevelopment. So I'm assuming that most of you here know the story that most of the Fillmore was torn down, not just the McAllister Street area, that, Japantown was the great majority of blocks of the Fillmore were destroyed during the periods of redevelopment. And there was a feeling of loss and remorse, whatever you call it. And when they were doing some rebuilding, they put some plaques into the pavement that noted some important, especially African-American and Jewish sites. So restaurants and synagogues, the former sites are mentioned in those plaques, but very few businesses other than restaurants are mentioned. And so that's too bad. I did come across Greenblatt's, but the truth is the best way probably to do some investigation is to go through city records, to try to go to the San Francisco Public Library's history room and to try to get somebody to help. There's, especially businesses, there's not a lot other than civic records that really can help with that kind of research. We're lucky with with synagogues, their life is, there was more in the newspapers, there was more conserved by the shuls themselves. That's just less the case with businesses.
There's a question from Stephen Klein. What were the public schools that children in the Fillmore attended?
Great question. So the two main ones were the Raphael Weil School, which is, I believe, Rosa Parks School now, and that's quite close to the, if you know the Fillmore Safeway, it's sort of not far, it's on the other side of Webster from that. And then there was one that I believe is called the Golden Gate School that's actually also still there. And that's the, I believe it's the middle school of the Creative Arts Charter School, and that's on Golden Gate between and Pierce. And that was the one that most of the Jewish kids went to. There was actually, I should have included a picture of the Raphael Weil School was a really wonderfully multicultural school because you had the kids from Japantown and you had Black kids and you had Jewish kids being schooled together. And importantly, there were no day schools. So Orthodox kids went to school, the same schools that secular kids went to. Ruth
Landy asks if you can share more about the German Jewish community's response to their fellow Jewish Eastern European arrivals.
Sure. Also, as an aside, because I just saw somebody say about, I just said Creative Arts Charter. It's not, it's the Gateway. It's the Gateway Middle School. Gateway High School is at the old girls' high school, which is at Geary and Scott, but it's the Golden Gate Elementary School is now Gateway Middle School. So sorry about that. So the question about, it's very complicated. I can share some material in what I send tomorrow. Basically, it's an understandable response, but it was a very interesting situation that the German Jews really had made it in San Francisco in a way that you rarely saw in another city. They had such, and there was not so much anti-Semitism relatively in San Francisco. And so they were very afraid. The establishment was very afraid when they saw what had happened in, in New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia with these very large Yiddish-speaking communities that had, if you read what, how Edith Wharton and Henry James talk about these, the off the boat Eastern European immigrants, I mean, there was a lot of hatred directed towards them, and the German Jews did not want to see that happen because it would also endanger their own standing in San Francisco. So they actively, one of the reasons that we didn't have a lot of Eastern European, say in Los Angeles, there were 50,000 Jews in Boyle Heights, Eastern European Jews in Boyle Heights. That's a lot more than in San Francisco. And at that time, Los Angeles wasn't bigger than San Francisco. And so one of the reasons that happened is because for immigrants to come, it was actually necessary for there to be a desire to take them. That was part, especially that was part of some of the plans, like the Schiff plans, like the Galveston plan, to bring people into other areas. There had to be jobs on the other end. There had to be some kind of welcome there, and the Emmanuel establishment basically did the opposite and said, we really don't want these people, and that was heard. So But it's a long story, and it continues. It continued through the Emmanuel supported the gave support to the left-wing chicken ranchers in Petaluma, not because they had affinity for left-wing chicken ranchers, but because it was to their advantage to keep them out of San Francisco.
David Fisher mentioned the Sephardic Synagogue on 4th and Geary, founded in 1932.
Yeah.
And I imagine maybe that's outside of the geographic scope that you were looking at, but I wonder if you can, if you have anything to say about how those communities, like the Ashkenazi communities and that's the Sephardic community, interacted.
Yeah, so that building on that, so that's on 4th between Geary and Clement. So that was originally a Baptist church, and then it was the first when Congregation Beth Shalom, which is just celebrated its 100th anniversary. That was the first building for Congregation Beth Shalom. They took over that Baptist church. And then in the early 1930s, when they built their own synagogue on 14th Avenue and Clement, Magen David, the Sephardic congregation, set up shop in that building. And Magen David was from the beginning a Sephardic congregation. I don't know enough about the relationships between the different groups. I know that B'nai David and the Mission, there was a substantial Sephardic cadre that also prayed in the synagogue. So there was a little bit of a mix within the synagogue, but I don't know enough about the relationships to really say much. But the congregation has continued since the 1930s there. And again, that's an emissary. I mean, that's a real Sephardic shul as opposed to Anshe Sephard, which became a Sephardic synagogue later in life.
Thank you, Howard. There was a question from Sarah Levin about the jazz era of the Fillmore district and whether Jews were involved in that at that time.
Yeah, so for the most part, not so much, with a couple exceptions. So one thing is there on the block of Fillmore between Geary and O'Farrell was a record shop called the Melrose Record Shop. And that was the main record shop of the Black community. And it was a Jewish-owned record shop. And there was another one as well that was Jewish-owned. The clubs themselves, one of the things that's actually remarkable, when she's referring to the jazz era, so there was a real, so the Black community in the Fillmore just expanded greatly during World War II, and the neighborhood became very dynamic. And lots of jazz clubs, and interestingly, most of those jazz clubs were not in what a lot of people think about as the Fillmore today, but they were north of Geary. So back then, it was, you would go up to California was the Fillmore. And before Geary was widened, Geary has, since it's widening, it has created this artificial barrier that created these two different neighborhoods. But so in that northern part of the Fillmore, you had a huge concentration of jazz clubs that featured some of the greatest musicians, really all the greatest jazz musicians of the mid 20th century. And those were mostly Black owned. In fact, as far as I know, every one of them was Black owned. And it was, there were a lot of Jewish jazz aficionados who came to them, but as far as I know, there wasn't Jewish involvement in their actual running. There may be an exception that I'm unaware of. And there's a great book for those of you who are unfamiliar with it called Harlem of the West, and that really beautifully chronicles that era going through each one of those jazz clubs.
Thank you. There's a question from Harry about the whether there are any videos that exist or film footage of the Jewish Fillmore district.
I hope so, and I've never seen it any. There has got to be home video. I mean, not home video, home movies taken by families that are within their own possession. And it would be wonderful if if somebody had the incentive to have that transferred, because that would benefit all of us. I can't emphasize enough how few images we have, considering this was such a mean, this is a great neighborhood, and there's very little to represent it for posterity. And I see the note about the PBS made a documentary of about the neighborhood, which is true. And the problem, I mean, it's a good documentary and really does a good job at capturing the redevelopment and all the politics and the pain around it. But only the first 2 minutes are about the Jewish experience, and it's minimal. And if somebody knows about something, I'd certainly love to hear it.
Helen Block asks about Emperor Norton.
So Emperor Norton is a 19th century figure, and so he predates, and he was a downtown person, so that he's part of the Jewish history of San Francisco and is a great, colorful figure. But for the most part, he comes earlier than this chapter and isn't sort of part of this story.
Thank you, Howard. That's all the questions that we have in the chat right now. A lot of folks shared reflections in the chat. If you want to save it and be able to look at the chat later and read some of those reflections, you can do so by clicking the 3 dots in the corner of your chat box and selecting Save Chat. And I just want to read out one reflection from Steven Steiner, who says, my dad moved from Yonkers to San Francisco in the mid-30s, changing his name from Steinschreiber to Steiner, making the name that much more recognizable and easier for the locals. Was the street named after my family? No, the family was named after the street.
That's great. I do want to correct something I just said. I just saw the full line about the video that that Robin Seeley mentioned, which is American Jerusalem, which is a different one, also about that's about 19th century, primarily the German Jews, which gives a great background on the German Jews and the sort of that first several waves of immigration to San Francisco, and I recommend that highly. The one I was talking about was the Fillmore documentary that was made for PBS locally. So I apologize, I read that full comment. There's a funny comment just hearing about the name changes that I read in researching Yehudi Menuhin, which is that when his parents were looking, before he was born, when they were looking to rent an apartment, they were told, oh, this place is a great one, and one of the nice things about it is there are no Jews here, not knowing that they were Jewish. And so in response, they named their son Yehudi, which means Jew. Okay, so it says here, one could also mention Bill Graham and his role in putting SF on the rock and roll map. He was a Jewish immigrant and promoted his acts at the Fillmore. Absolutely. He escaped the Holocaust, and the story of the Fillmore Auditorium, which was next to Congregation Beth Israel, is an essential part of San Francisco history, and he was unapologetically Jewish, and it was really he was a very important person. So all right, any other questions?
I think that's all we've got here. Thank you so much, Howard.
Great. Okay. Well, I can always be reached to if you have any questions, or I love hearing these different stories, the family stories, and it would be nice if there were an opportunity to collect them. I may send out something about a possible, for people who would like to be able to actually talk and about some of their family experiences. It would be nice to be able to use this technology, as long as we have it, to connect with one another. And that would be a treat for me as well. So again, thanks, and be well, everybody. Please be safe. I happen to have COVID in my household right now, my children, and it's really not a good time. So please be safe in what you do right now, and be well.
Take care, everyone.